Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I realize it is early evening in Ethiopia, and we do appreciate that you were able to take the time out of your busy day to meet with us this evening. So let me introduce myself. I'm Ella August. I have been working with CERT for, maybe almost 2 years, I think now. And I have been to Ethiopia already several times to do trainings and have had the pleasure of meeting some of your colleagues. And my organization is called PREPS, Pre-Publication Support Service. And I organize all of the trainings and author support through my organization. I also am a clinical assistant professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. And I will let Clara introduce herself.
So I'm Clara Schremer, and I'm the associate editor at PREPS. I graduated with my master's of public health degree from the University of Michigan this spring. Yep.
Okay, now we'd like to hear from our participants. If you could briefly share your name, the name of your institution, and a short summary of your research topic.
My name is Alma Zafdino from Bardar University, and my research topic is non-pharmacological liver pain management and the associated factor in Amara Health institutions. Thank you.
I am Mangustu.
Hi, welcome.
From Makala University.
And what is your research area?
And mine is science section using Robson's classification, 10 groups classification. So we are trying to classify women-based or into 10 groups. Instead of indication.
I'm going to go ahead and start with an outline of the webinar. We have the webinar organized into two halves. So we'll start off by talking about strategies for journal selection. That is the journal that you choose to submit your paper to. And we'll say a little bit about avoiding predatory journals.
Introduce yourself, please.
And then we'll move on to some basics about what it means. If you wouldn't mind muting your microphone while we're presenting so that the noise doesn't interfere with the presentation. And then we'll move on to ethical guidelines, and we'll cover some basic ethical guidelines. And we'll talk about developing a solid research question. I'm sure that at this point, you all have your research questions in place, but it's also true that we tend to fine-tune our research questions continually and right until the moment of publication, just to make sure that the wording is clear and that we're clearly articulating what it is that our goal for the manuscript. In the second half, we'll talk about developing an effective title, which is very important. It's an invitation for people to read your work. And we will cover a brief overview of the introduction, methods, results, and discussion sections, just to try to set you up so you have some framework to get started on a strong first draft of your paper. And then finally, we'll talk about submitting your paper to a journal, which again, I recognize that you're not ready to submit your paper.
Please use the chat function here if you have any questions.
We'll be ready to really hit the ground running during the workshop. And then we'll end with a conclusion and wrap up. So again, I'd like to remind everybody if you could please mute your microphones during the presentation. Thank you. I'm going to let Clara discuss the learning objectives.
Sure. There's several learning objectives that we hope you come away with. So first, we'd like you to understand the strategies for selecting appropriate target journals for your scientific manuscript. Then we'd like you to learn what plagiarism is and know what the consequences of plagiarism are in the context of scientific publishing. Understand how to develop a clear and testable research question, and that's something we'll spend quite a bit of time discussing today. And then understand the basic structure of a scientific journal article. And number 5, bonus.
Bonus objective.
Recognize the steps needed to successfully submit a scientific manuscript to a peer-reviewed journal.
Okay, and I want to emphasize that, I don't know, Lizzie, did you have a chance to send the PDFs to the participants?
Not yet. I'm working on that right now.
Okay, so you should be receiving the PDF of this slide file very soon. If you don't receive it during the webinar, you will receive it at some point very soon after the webinar. So don't worry about scribbling down notes. You will have access to this file. So I'm going to start by talking about strategies for selecting a journal. And again, we will do some activities that will help you choose a target journal during the actual workshop. But it's really important to think about early, and I just want to start setting the stage for this activity, because the journal that you choose will really define who your readers are. And depending on who your readers are, you're really going to have to write your paper differently. For example, if you are writing a paper about prenatal care and you submit your article to a very general journal like PLOS One, you're going to have to explain a lot of background about prenatal care, pregnancy, all of the things to help people really understand your research. Because at a journal that's very general like PLOS One, you're going to have a lot of people reading your paper who aren't in that area of research. However, if you decide to submit your paper to BMC, pregnancy and childbirth, that's going to be written very differently, because your readers will already know something about pregnancy and prenatal care. So I just want to set the stage a little bit about this activity and strategies that, again, we will employ these strategies together as a group when we're together. The first strategy you can use for selecting a journal is to enter keywords into a database from your article. So if you were writing a journal article about prenatal care, you could, prenatal care would be 2 of the keywords that you would use, into some database like PubMed or Google Scholar, and then just look at what journals come up in the results section. You'll get a list of articles. Look at what journals those articles are published in, and that will give you a pretty good idea about appropriate journals to publish that content in. One very easy strategy is to simply look and see what articles you're citing in your reference list. Again, chances are those are going to be very suitable journals for that content area. There are search engines specifically designed excuse me, to help people choose a target journal. One of those search engines is called JANE, Journal Author Name Estimator, and I've included the web address of the search engine. I'm not going to go through an example now. We'll do that together in the workshop. But if you want to try it out, just to see what results you come up with, you can go ahead and use this web address here. There are other search engines as well. I'm just providing the name and address of another option, Global Health Journal Search. It's organized in a slightly different way, but it's fairly easy to navigate. One thing you'll really want to keep in mind if you are the first author and you're a more junior person and you are partnering with a senior author, it's absolutely essential for you to discuss your choice of journal with your senior author and your other co-authors to make sure that you all agree, but particularly your senior authors on the paper will have a lot of experience to share with you and may have some really great suggestions. Finally, it's important that you're choosing a journal that's going to be easy for people to find. For that reason, you want to make sure to note where the journal is indexed. Is it indexed in Scopus? Is it indexed in Web of Science, PubMed? All these are scientific databases. So you want to make sure that the journal will be easy to find, but also that it's a legitimate journal and not a predatory journal. So understanding where the journal is indexed will help you learn a lot of information about that journal. And so the final thing I'll say about selecting a journal is that you should use multiple strategies. You could even use all of these strategies, not just one, not just two, just to make sure you're really getting as much information and making a thoughtful choice. So I'll just say a few more words about choosing a target journal. I will say that choosing the wrong journal generally falls into two buckets, or there's two scenarios that typically are the reason why it's the wrong journal. The first reason is typically that a journal is out of the, it's out of the scope of the article. So in other words, that journal does not tend to publish the type of content that is included in your paper. And so that's actually easy to avoid if you do your homework and you really look at the journal, you look at examples, and you really carefully make that choice. So I'm going to help you avoid choosing the wrong journal scope. The other scenario is a little bit more challenging to avoid. And in this scenario, your paper or the paper that someone is submitting is not high enough impact for a journal. In other words, it might not be timely enough, it might not be groundbreaking enough. It could be that the paper that you're writing is really just setting the stage for research. Maybe it's descriptive research. And so you need to really have a handle on or understand whether your paper is appropriate in terms of impact for the journal that you're choosing. So in other words, if you have written a descriptive paper, it could be that the New England Journal of Medicine or the Journal of American Medical Association feels that it's not enough of an impact. And so we'll talk a lot more about impact and how to assess whether your paper is a good fit for the journal that you're choosing. But often when I'm in these workshops and training people, I get a question that goes something like this. I came up with a list of journals. Some are very competitive and have a high impact factor. I think that JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, has an impact factor of about 40. And that goes, you know, impact factors can go down all the way down to below 1, actually, believe it or not. So the question is, how can I judge what tier journal is appropriate for my paper? How do I really get a handle on the type of impact that's appropriate given my research? So I will say right now that the impact of a journal, otherwise known as journal tier, is related to the quality of the method section and the data and the impact and novelty of the research. And it's really this last part that can be very, very important, the impact and newness of the research question. And there's no real, I would say, quick and dirty way to, there's no metric you can really use. There's no website you can go to. There's no algorithm to be able to judge what the appropriate tier journal is. It's really just boils down to experience. And so again, for this particular question, I would encourage junior researchers to consult with your senior co-authors. Of course, you can always talk with Clara and I as well, and we're here to help you make that assessment. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Clara.
The one thing that Ella briefly mentioned as she was discussing how to select a journal was that you should be avoiding predatory journals. So first, predatory journals, we'll define that. Predatory journals are dishonest journals or publishers who publish articles with little or no real peer review. And remember that peer review really is the bedrock of scientific publishing. Peer review is what legitimizes your research in a public space. And so predatory journals eschew that requirement, and often they publish papers with no rigorous peer review, and they really want your money. So often these are scams. They will often send emails inviting you to submit a paper, and that's not typically the case for other journals. Publishing in a predatory journal will hurt your career. It undermines the legitimacy of your research. So we're going to give you a couple of strategies to assess whether or not a journal is predatory. We want you to note that Beall's list, which was formerly a resource for assessing whether or not a journal is predatory, is no longer active. So it won't be helpful for you to use it. That's not a strategy that we recommend. We recommend that you consult your colleagues and mentors to assess whether or not a journal is predatory. Your colleagues and mentors will have a very good idea usually of reputable journals and those that are not reputable. Use the website thinkchecksubmit.org, and we'll show you a little bit more about that on the next slide. So this is thinkchecksubmit.org. And so just like we have outlined a couple of strategies for assessing whether or not a journal is predatory, the thinkchecksubmit.org prompts you to think about a number of criteria which will help you to evaluate whether a chosen journal is reputable. So things like, do you or your colleagues know the journal? Could you easily identify and contact the publisher? Are articles indexed in services that you use? Do you recognize the editorial board? Things like that. So you really need to do your homework when you're deciding where you want to submit your research article, because you want to find a suitable home for that, a suitable journal to publish that work. And you certainly want to avoid the professional damage of publishing in a predatory journal. We recommend that you use multiple strategies to assess whether a journal is predatory, just as you use multiple strategies to select a journal that's appropriate.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and take it from here with the authorship basics. I want to make sure that you can all hear me clearly. I have a microphone that I can use, and it's right here next to my computer. So if you are not able to hear us clearly, please type that in the chat box and we will switch over to the microphone. So I'm going to keep talking, but if we do get any chats, we will make the switch because we want to make sure that you can hear us clearly. So you may have a question about authorship, and that question might be, who qualifies to be an author? And it turns out that somebody has already thought of that. And there, in fact, are international, very accepted criteria about who qualifies to be an author on an academic journal article. And I have included the link below to the website that defines authorship. You will see these criteria in most journal author submission guidelines. They're very standard across different academic journals. So I'm just going to go over those now. To qualify to be an author, you must have substantially contributed to the conception or design of the research study, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data. And you must have drafted the work or revise the paper critically for important intellectual content, and approve the final version to be published, and agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring that questions related to accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. And typically, excuse me, when you submit a paper to a journal, they will ask you to sort of check boxes to actually verify that you have done all of these things or that you fit all of these criteria. And this is an example screenshot from a journal article that was published in PLOS One, some research that was done in Ethiopia. And you can see, if you look down at the very bottom of this screenshot, you can actually see where they are publishing for each one of those author criteria, which authors fit those criteria. So ET, AC, AA, those are the initials of the author. So this is becoming much more prevalent. Not only do you need to confirm that you fit the author criteria, but in fact, those criteria will be published on the first page of the paper. So journals do take this very seriously. Another question that often comes up when you're collaborating on a paper is what order the authors should be in. And when I am there in person, we will have a discussion about this. It's true that different fields have different conventions about who should be first author, who should be last author. I'm right now collaborating with someone from a composition and rhetoric department down in Tennessee, and they have totally opposite conventions as the sciences. So it's interesting to kind of talk to people about this and to learn about the different conventions in the different areas. But I think that public health and medicine have similar conventions when it comes to authorship and the order of authors on a paper. Typically, the first author has written the draft of the paper. So they will take a first pass, come up with the first draft, and then circulate it to the other co-authors. Often the first author tends to be the junior person on the study and on the paper. And typically the last author is the senior person, either the person who obtained the funding or for some other reason, the senior person on the paper. It's not to say that people never deviate from these conventions, but this is typically how people organize authorship in the science. And if you do have any questions about authorship, please go ahead and type those. I see that Clara is on the keyboards here responding to questions, so keep those questions coming. It's very common that issues arise in this organization of who is an author and what order the authors will be presented in. So my advice to you is be very clear about authorship from the start. You should already be talking to your co-authors to decide who is going to be on the author list and what order you will be presented in the author list, because that really defines your roles and what you're going to do on the paper. So again, I think I sort of covered this point. Deciding who is an author is contingent on the area of study you are in, and often it also can depend on the institution that you're in. And again, journals will ask how each author contributed to the paper. Talk to authors early to clarify roles and author order. And once you have that discussion with your co-authors, I would put right in the draft version of the paper, create a title page and put those authors down according to what you believe to be the agreement among the group. So it's right there early on the title page on the draft. So just to reduce confusion as much as possible. Yeah, I think I already covered this point as well. So again, I think I already gave an example. This is just another example of copied right from a publication. Was in, I don't have it here, which paper, which journal this was in, but I wanted to make one more point about authorship, and that is that the acknowledgement section is a good place for you to thank people who really helped you. I'm sure all of you have had people who were so helpful to you in completing your research. People who were entering data, people who were helping you to collect the data, people, your research participants. And you want to be able to formally thank these people for all the effort that they put in helping you get this paper off the ground. Well, if people don't qualify for authorship, the acknowledgments is a great place for you to be able to formally thank them, put their name in print, and include them and recognize them on the paper. And this is just an example from a published paper, so you can see a model of how acknowledgments are, typically written to thank people who don't qualify as authors.
So another important topic to discuss, I guess, throughout the research process, certainly now is a good time, are ethical guidelines. So there are a number of common ethical issues that arise during the research process. One that because we talk about scientific writing, that is the scope of our organization, one that we commonly see, well, most often see, I think, is plagiarism. So the definition of plagiarism is theft or misappropriation of intellectual property and the substantial unattributed textual copying of another's work. So that is copying someone else's ideas or text without giving them credit. And so maybe to expound upon this idea a bit more, something would still be considered plagiarism if you copied the text of another paper word for word, even if you cite it, if you do not use quotation marks. So I'll say that one more time. So without quotation marks, you are not allowed to copy word for word the text of another paper. Ella's nodding in agreement.
Absolutely.
Yes. So just an important point that if you want to copy another individual's writing word for word, you need to use quotation marks and cite that work in parentheses at the end of the sentence and in your reference list. If you do not wish to copy someone's ideas word for word, but just to convey the message that they set forth, then you can restate that idea in your own words and then cite them at the end of the sentence in parentheses and in your reference list.
The strategy, the latter strategy that Clara presented is really the best strategy. It's really not appropriate to be quoting articles word for word, even if you do include the quotation marks. Your job is to synthesize the research and to present it in the framework of your own arguments and your own research. So that's really what you should be doing, is reading the literature, learning from it, and then synthesizing it and then presenting it in the context of your own thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great point. So while it's allowable, it's not really recommended that you copy someone's thoughts word for word. And if you have any additional questions about plagiarism or really anything throughout this presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. And I'll say that again, you can email us if there's a specific example of an instance that you're not sure about, whether something would be considered plagiarism or not. Plagiarism is a serious issue, and I'll dive into some of the consequences of that in the following slide. Another ethical issue is that you submit a paper to more than one journal at a time. This is very much frowned upon in the cover letter or submission materials. When you submit your paper to a journal, often journals will ask you to explicitly state that you have not submitted your paper to more than one journal at a time. It's just not honest. So another ethical issue is that you would not obtain consent from participants. Often an internal review board or ethical committee at your institution will have very stringent requirements about obtaining consent from the participants in your research study. It's very important, and that needs to be a consideration from the inception of your research project. An additional ethical issue is that you would not obtain approval from the Ethics Committee for Human or Animal Research. You absolutely need to move through the appropriate channels for legitimizing your research, including obtaining approval from your ethics community for Ethics Committee for Human or Animal Research at your institution or any partner institution that's involved. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the chat box. Dr. Ella August is currently on the job. So this is an example of some of the consequences of plagiarism. Authors from, some researchers from Nepal actually were fired for plagiarizing scientific literature. And so this was published on Retraction Watch. These are just examples of the data and text that they copied. And there are serious consequences for plagiarism, including that journals may publish a retraction of your work. They might inform your institution that you're from. They may, for a time, refuse to consider future work that you wish to publish. And I think in terms of your reputation, plagiarism certainly hurts your professional reputation and the rapport that you have with colleagues. Ella, do you want to spend any additional time on ethical issues?
No, we can. But if you can, please keep them coming.
Yes, certainly.
Okay, so I have some great questions come across. I was looking while Clara was speaking on the chat function. The first question a few people asked is whether you could access the plagiarism checker software. And the plagiarism software that journals use is typically the one they use is called Authenticate. It's actually quite expensive, and it's not something that individual people can afford to buy. I have made a note that I will double check with Preet the librarian to ask her if there might be a free version. I know that sometimes students have access to software that is provided by the university to put their work through a plagiarism checker. But I mean, the reality is that you should know if you're plagiarizing based on the definition. But that said, I will see if I can find a free version of the software for you. Do you have something to add? Okay. Yes. My experience is that plagiarism is taken very, very seriously by journals, and we see it, honestly, at preps when authors have submitted their work to us. And, we're not specifically looking for it, but sometimes we stumble across it. We want to help to protect you and your reputation and your ability to be successful. Plagiarism has very serious consequences and will be taken very seriously by grant funding organizations and academic journals. So absolutely, I would strongly recommend to avoid it at all costs. It's very, very serious, and I think that so we see that as our job to really convey that information to you as a sort of an international standard. Did you want to add something?
I'm wondering if the intent of the chat question was posed that gathering community consent or buy-in is another ethical issue that's pretty important. If you'd like to clarify in the chat, maybe that would be helpful.
Okay.
Certainly plagiarism is very important.
Okay.
Do you have any experience with focus groups or making sure that communities are
I think there's actually a lot to say about that, and there's a lot of ways in which community buy-in, I could not agree more, is so important. And there's a lot to that question, and I feel like if there's a specific question that I can answer, I'm happy to do that. But we could have a broader discussion about it in person as well. I'll just say quickly, part of it, if you're collecting data from the community, one way in which you can really establish that trust and that sense of support from the community is to talk to the community, and even we have what we call town hall meetings with the community residents to really explain to them what you're trying to accomplish with the research and why it's important, and then also to really make an effort to give the results back to the community. I think that's where researchers fall short a lot of times, is they don't relay the results and the findings back to the community members, not just in the form of the academic paper, but also in plain language that might be more accessible for a public audience to really understand, and to really even give presentations, and to even thank the community for participating, just to let them know that you haven't forgotten about them. So hopefully that answers. I think I misunderstood when Clara read the initial question, but please let us know if there's any other specific parts of that question we can address. I'm turning this because I think the window's too glary. One other question came through about the author list. Someone wanted to know if there is a student on a paper and that student has 2 advisors, then how would you organize the order of the author list? And that's a great question, because what I had presented earlier is that the student typically would be the first author and the advisor would be the last author. So if you have a situation where there's 3 people who are playing prominent roles, that is the student and 2 advisors, the next most important authorship position is second. So the student, presumably who's writing the draft of the paper, would still be first author. The 2 advisors are going to have to decide who's going to be last author, and the other person will be second author. And second place is recognized as the third most important, I guess, position of authorship, of the author roles. And I can talk to you more about this specific situation. But if the research was funded, it could be that whoever got the funding would be in that prime last position, or maybe just depending on workload, you could divide it up that way. But typically, I guess the short answer is someone will be last and someone will be second. So we could talk more about that as well. Okay, So let me move on to talk about research questions. I want to first start by clarifying, I've made reference to research question a couple of times now, but when I talk about a research question, I'm not only talking about a question, I'm talking about a general term that includes the research objective, the aim, the research hypothesis, as well as research questions. Different researchers will word their research objective or aim differently, sometimes as a hypothesis, sometimes as a question, sometimes as an objective or an aim. Typically, the research question is placed at the end of the introduction section. It should be a bridge between how you set up the research topic of your paper and to the methods of how you actually did the work. So there's certain components that should always be included in the type of research you're doing, traditional health research, so that your research question can be as informative as possible. You should include the dependent and independent variables, the study design, the timing. And so when I say timing, I mean, for example, if it's a longitudinal study, did it take place over 2 weeks or 2 years or 2 decades? And also, when were the data collected? Were they collected in the year 2000 or were they collected in 2016? And also the sample or the population that you are representing in your study, pregnant women, etc., as well as the setting. And again, the type of research you're doing, the setting is going to be important. And I would encourage you to make the setting as qualitative and understandable as possible to an outside audience. So if you talk about the setting as St. Paul's, hospital in Addis Ababa, or the name of another hospital, or even the name of a city in Ethiopia, people from outside Ethiopia are not going to understand what that is or where that is. So I would encourage you, instead of listing specific city names or institution names, qualitatively describe the type of setting. For example, it's an urban government hospital, or it's a rural region that's sparsely populated, etc. Because really what you're trying to do is make your research come across to people outside Ethiopia who have no knowledge about Ethiopia or the region. You want to make sure that if they are doing research or they are working in an urban hospital in Latin America, down in Mexico or Guatemala, that they might see the how your research might apply to them. So that's really the goal, is to be as broad and generalizable as possible. And so you're going to really have to step outside your own setting and think about how somebody from outside Ethiopia is going to think about your research when they're reading your paper. Do you have anything to add?
I didn't think so.
Oops, I think I have one more. So looks like I have a few more slides here. So of course, we all want to be clear with our research question, and brief. You want to include, I guess it's a tension between clarity, which might involve more words, and brevity, to make sure that you're being succinct. You do want to be detailed and specific, including all of those elements I mentioned on the previous slide. One important thing to think about is your research question needs to be answerable in the context of your research study. It needs to be fairly self-contained and specific for that reason. What I like to tell people is that you should be able to imagine the data analysis after reading the research question. It should be that specific. So this is an example of a research question here. Therefore, the purpose of this study was to assess the magnitude of antenatal depressive disorders and identify predictors of antenatal depressive symptoms among Adama Hospital antenatal clinic attendants. Okay, so if you think about a potential model And could you identify what are the outcome variables, what are the exposure variables? In other words, what are the dependent variables and what are the independent variables? So I think it's pretty clear after reading this example that the outcome or dependent variable is antenatal depressive disorders. I think we tend to use outcome as opposed to dependent variable more often in epidemiology, so I try to catch myself there. And then the predictors of antenatal depressive symptoms, of course, would be on the right side of the equation here. Those are the independent variables. So I would say that in general, we have a pretty good idea of how they're going to actually do their data analysis based on how this question is worded. Okay.
So this, I think, formally introduces the second half of our webinar content. So we'll delve into each component of your scientific research article in these next couple of sections. So first, we'll start with titles. Titles, I think, are an often overlooked element of a research paper, and they're so important. So I guess first, maybe people can answer in the chat function. Which title do you like better? Title A, and so these aren't really synonymous, but they are easy to compare, I guess. So title A is Determinants of Facility-Based Childbirth in Indonesia. Title B is Determinants of Neonatal Mortality in Rural Northern Ethiopia, a population-based nested case control study. So maybe if you could take a moment to respond in the chat function and share, vote for which title do you think is better, and maybe a word or two about the things you like about the title you selected as superior. B, yeah. So people are singing the praises of title B. I do think Ella hit on the touched on the tension, even within a research question, about wanting the research question and the title is the same way to be clear, so providing enough detail that the question or the title is clear, and then making it very parsimonious, so not including so much detail that you lose the plot because there are too many words. So I think the title A versus title B matchup really helps us to think about this. So title A, definitely less words and or less detail. Title B has quite a bit more detail. I think I am partial to title B. So we can very clearly ascertain from reading title B, even though it's still fairly short. I don't think it's too long as scientific research article titles go, but we can clearly assess that the study was a nested case control study, and it was population based. I think that's important as we consider research. The design of the research study is communicated even within the title. Mm-hmm. I think that that's pretty important. And we get to learn the topic, determinants of neonatal mortality, which is important. And I'll echo another thing that Ella said, which is that the authors qualitatively described the setting of the study. So instead of naming a town in rural northern Ethiopia that people who have never been to Ethiopia may not know, the authors choose instead to say rural northern Ethiopia, which helps readers to say, okay, well, I am thinking about a rural community too. What about this study could be relevant in my study setting? Do you have anything else to add, Ella?
No. Really hit on the important points of why I also like, I would say, B better. I think that title A, even though it is shorter, which some people like. It's lacking a lot of detail. For example, what type of setting in Indonesia? Indonesia is, is it rural? Is it urban? There's a lot of ways in which you could qualitatively describe the setting. Also, I am wondering if they're talking about home-based versus facility-based childbirth. I think maybe that is what they're describing in this title, but it's not 100% clear. And so I think more information would be helpful. Yeah.
And if you have additional comments about the titles or questions, certainly different researchers have different sort of styles that they prefer for their titles. A colon can be a very helpful tool because you can kind of do two titles in one. If you notice, title B is Determinants of Neonatal Mortality in Rural Northern Ethiopia, colon, a population-based nested case control study. So I think one of the intents of publishing a scientific research study is that you want your research to be read by a lot of other researchers and then to be cited by a lot of other researchers. And researchers, I think, are very busy people. So if you can convey very succinctly within the title, the most salient features of your study, you draw readers in because they're very clear about what the study focus is, what the study design is. I mean, maybe researchers are only interested in reading cohort studies. So if you note in your title that you used a cohort study design, then that's going to draw a reader in.
Reframe what Clara said. I will add that another way of saying that is researchers use titles as an indexing tool. When authors are searching, and they will search on your paper based on how it was done, if they might want to, for example, look at cross-sectional studies or longitudinal studies or intervention studies, that's important, one important quality of a research study. So having more information in the title is very helpful when people are searching, both to capture it in the keywords as people do searches, but also make it interesting, make it rich. The more details are in your title, the more interesting and inviting your title would be. Like thousands of people are going to read the title of your paper. Maybe only hundreds will actually read your paper. So it should be an invitation. I have a few other questions. Is there a word limit for titles?
Yes and no. Yes.
For the
there are in the journal guidelines.
Big limit. That you can use for your title. Yeah.
Certainly, though, you do not want to, like we were speaking about before, there's a tension between wanting to include lots of details and wanting to manage the word count in your title. So there are some titles that I've read are just too long. I think I don't have a definite rule to convey other than to say that you should look at the author guidelines and then not multiple sentences.
Yeah. Some journals have very, very specific requirements about titles. So some journals, one example of that is some journals will require you to put the results in your title. For Title B, it might be something like, what would be an example for this? What's a determinant? Might be the most important? Low birth weight is the most important determinant of neonatal mortality in rural northern Ethiopia. So that would be an example of putting your results in the title. And again, that's going to be very journal specific. It's kind of a like spoiler alert, like here's what the research is about. Here is our main finding. but they feel that, again, that is helping people find the article and more likely to read the article. So one strategy you can use is to, once you choose a target journal, to read some examples of titles on similar topics as yours.
Great discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of your participation. So I think we've probably covered all of this already, but the functions of a title are numerous. One of them is to capture your reader's interest. Your title will be read by thousands. Ella apparently really likes to say that. And fewer will read your entire paper, and that's just the fact of the matter, right? So we want to make sure that the titles really succinctly convey the most salient features of our research study. Another function of a title is to identify the paper's main topic or message. It's used as an indexing tool, and that is a really important concept. So you might want to use popular phrases or words, and Ella, I think, within her workshop discusses keywords, which are another important component of a research article, and you can be pretty strategic about the way that you use words in your title and keywords. So some advice about titles. Review examples and the guidelines from the journal. Many journals will have pretty rigid guidelines that you will need to adhere to. Where appropriate, extend the title beyond regional area to other settings. And the approach there, I think, is to qualitatively describe the setting. Instead of saying Addis Ababa, you can say urban, that kind of thing. So an example is a title, Health Information Seeking Behaviors Among Pregnant Teenagers in Isu Juaibin Municipality in Ghana. So is anyone aware of that particular city region? I am not. So I wonder if you could have said, or this author could have said, urban or rural, sparsely or densely populated, tertiary health facility, that kind of thing. Qualitative descriptors are very important. Use keywords to supplement your title. And Ella, do you want to expound upon that, or just say that we'll describe that in your workshop?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say that that you should, in thinking about how people are going to find your article in searching for it, the keywords should not be exactly the same as the words in your title. You want to give people as many opportunities as possible to find your work. So having different words in the title and other words in your as your keywords are going to give people more opportunities to find your article depending on what words they type into the search engine.
Great. And maybe it's a good strategy to wait to write your title until you have written the rest of your research paper. That's a strategy I like to employ, at least. And ask a colleague to give feedback on your title. Feedback is an important part of the scientific writing process across all of the elements, title included. Don't use abbreviations in your title unless they're very common. So that would be like DNA or RNA. Otherwise, you should spell that out because you want people to find your paper.
Okay. Now, I'm just going to say a few words, or we're just going to say a few words about each section of your paper because I know that you're in the beginning stages, and I also recognize that for many of you, you may have already written other papers. But for those of you who are writing a paper for the first time, we just want to make sure that you have are being as efficient as possible in creating your first draft. So we're going to give you some basic guidance. It turns out that, you know, writing a journal article, especially the introduction section, but really all the sections of your academic article, it's pretty formulaic. So I'm going to show you how I like to explain how to write an introduction section. There are 5 elements that should go into your introduction. The first one is that you need to start off by making the argument that the research is important, that people should really care about your research, and tell them why. This is sometimes referred to as the so what. Number 2, you're going to have to explain what is already known about the topic. Number 3, what is not known about the topic, and that is sometimes referred to as the research gap. So what you're doing here in number 3 is you're setting yourself up to be able to fill that gap. And number 4 is why it's important to learn this new information that's not known. And finally, you end the introduction section with the research questions / objective / hypothesis. So I'm just going to say a few more things about, oh, yes. And you are also, depending on the journal that you are going to submit your paper to, you'll have to provide background along the way. Typically, I know that when you wrote your proposals, you wrote a very long introduction section, and that is appropriate for a proposal. However, published papers are much more concise. And note, and you all know this because you've read published papers, but the length of an academic article for the introduction section is really 3 to 5 paragraphs, sometimes 6 paragraphs. But you're going to have to be super efficient to make all of these arguments in such a short amount of space. So again, we'll do more work on this in the workshop, but start thinking about how to condense all that work you did in your proposal to be this length. Some quick points of advice: make sure your literature review is complete. Make sure you're really hitting on all the recent articles and research in the area so that the reviewers know that you know what is happening in that research area. So you're really making sure to include those citations to those most recent articles in your introduction section. Your introduction section should be very focused. If your population is females, let's say teenagers who are pregnant in Ethiopia. Well, as much as possible, your introduction section should only be discussing research that's relevant to teen pregnancies in Ethiopia. If there isn't any research on teen pregnancies in Ethiopia, then you'll go and try to find other neighboring countries or other countries in Africa that did similar research with a similar population, teen pregnancies in, Rwanda or wherever it may be. But you should be really focused as much as possible on your population and on your topic. And I think I already mentioned the length. Okay.
Next element of a scientific research article is the method section. So writing the method section, you'll need to explain how the study was done, justify why you used the particular methods that you did, and you need to provide context to understand and interpret the results and enable the replication of your study. And that is an important tenet of scientific research, replicability. So those are the bones, so that's the scaffolding of your method section. So what to include? You want to discuss the setting and the participants. You'll want to describe the study design and the timing of the study. Maybe seasonality is very important to your study, so you want to describe the specific time of year that the study took place. The specific information that you include about, say, timing would be study specific. How you recruited participants or your sampling methods, that should be included in the method section, as well as the process by which you collected data. Descriptions of your dependent, independent, variables and your covariates. You'll need to define those, justify their inclusion or explain what they are. And then you'll need to describe the analysis that you did, explain each part of the research objective and question. And I think that that's very important. If you have if your research has 2 aims, you need to describe the analysis for both aims in your methods section. Often we see papers that neglect one of the research aims, and that certainly needs to be consideration as you're writing your paper.
To what Clara just said, I think it's also really important in the method section to be really clear and to say, for our first aim, X, we did this analysis. For the second part of the research question, we addressed it like this. So that's the first point. The second point I want to make is this second to last bullet about describing every single variable and how you measured it. In including that in the methods section, justifying and explaining why they're included and how you measured it, very important and so often missing. I would say that's probably missing in 60 to 70% of the papers that I read. So any covariates you come across in the results section, anything that's included in a table in the results, that should be explained in the methods. So one thing you can do is go through your tables and make sure all those variables that are presented in the tables in the results section are explained how you measured those variables, as well as justifying why you measured those variables and included them in your study.
And the final thing that we recommend you always include is the ethical approval that you received in order to conduct the study. So organizing your methods section, that should be dictated by the author guidelines. That's why we described so in depth the process of selecting a target journal, because a lot of these requirements for writing are journal specific. So you'll want to have in mind before you get too far into writing exactly what your target journal is, so that you can look up those author guidelines and organize your method section and really your entire research paper in accordance with those. So you can also look up examples from a target journal. I think that that's a very helpful strategy for me. I like to see an example of work on a similar topic or with a similar study design, and that often reminds me of things that I need to, like details that I may have been missing. Look to papers that you admire to help shape your own writing. And the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has some helpful information on preparing an article for submission. And the Equator Network also has helpful resources. And the links are available within the slide deck that you'll be given. Great.
Okay, so now I'm just going to briefly go over some tips for developing your results. And I'm going to start with a few recommendations. Again, many of these recommendations are based on years of reading papers and seeing the kind of common pitfalls that people experience. So I'm going to try to help you avoid those problems when you're drafting your results. One of them is make sure you include the direction of the association. So what do I mean by that? You see in this example, we're talking about women who delivered by inexperienced midwives had higher rate of severe perineal tears compared with women delivered by highly experienced midwives. So the key word that I want to point your attention to in this example is higher. So we're not saying that the women delivered by inexperienced midwives had a different rate than those delivered by highly experienced midwives. We're giving a specific word to tell the readers that it was a higher rate. So often that's missing, And so make sure you're always giving the direction of an association. This is an example from a published paper, and I still see these a lot, where there's no direction included. So this is saying that maternal education and marital status, parity, mode of delivery, and birth order were statistically associated with early initiation of breastfeeding. So, for each one of these factors, it really should, the author should really be describing which direction. For example, women who were more educated were more likely to initiate breastfeeding early. Women who were married were more likely to initiate breastfeeding early, etc. So this is not a very informative sentence. So sometimes people say, well, it's obvious. You don't need to spell it out because it's already obvious what the direction of the association is. Even if it seems obvious to you, still be very, very specific in your results. The second recommendation is to focus on associations rather than statistical tests. Actually, going back a previous slide, I noticed that this negative example is doing exactly what I'd like you to avoid, even with respect to the second recommendation. They're focusing on the analysis. Binary logistic regression analysis showed. So I would really suggest that you avoid that. This example as well is focusing on just sort of spitting out these beta coefficients instead of really describing in words what the associations are. So you could see here, it's really a list of betas that they're showing rather than describing each association in words. So if I were going to advise this text to focus on describing the association in words instead, I would do something like this. For each 1 unit increase in BMI, a woman's fracture risk score decreased by 0.23 points. And then you can include the beta coefficient and the confidence interval in parentheses afterward. But really focus on using words and language as much as possible, because that's how our brains take in information. It's going to be much more clear. Oh, the last point here is I suggest that instead of including p-values, like the example on the left, that you include a confidence interval, because there's more information in the confidence interval. And I don't know if you had that advice given to you in your training. I know you had some research training. The p-values are becoming somewhat less acceptable, even in journals, published journals. Sometimes, for example, the American Journal of Epidemiology does not allow p-values. They only want confidence intervals. So confidence interval just gives you a little more information. So I won't dwell on that, but that's just another piece of advice. Sorry, some advice about some tables, developing tables and figures. Again, you should be focusing on giving a clear message, complement rather than repeat the text. So this is important. So what you want to avoid is creating a big table and then just putting all of the information from the table in the results text as well. The table should include the detailed results, and the text should focus on big picture patterns and trends, and maybe highlight 1 or 2 of the really key findings from the table, but it shouldn't feel repetitive. Figures and tables should be understandable on their own without reading the text. And the title or the legend should be very complete. And I'll show a few examples of that. And then colors, and we'll talk more about contrast and color in a workshop. But they should make your figure easy to read. And I encourage you to use color when you can. A lot of the online journals don't charge anything extra for color because it's, if it's published online, it's free. In general, figures are more interesting and easier to understand than tables. So if you have, if possible, make a figure. So this is an example of a table title that would be more complete. So you could see all this information that they're including. The setting, Ethiopia, the year the data were collected, 2008. So all of this information should be included in your table title, even table 1. You know, that's just descriptive information. The example here is, I would call this a negative example. I applaud these authors for using color. However, the colors are not easy to distinguish. You could either use very, very different colors that are much more obviously different, or you can use dashes or other techniques like that to distinguish the lines from each other. This is an example of a table that could be made into a fairly compelling figure, and I remade the table. This is the same information presented as a figure. It's just more interesting, it's more compelling, it's more inviting. You could see that also I rewrote the title. The title here is more complete. And you can still include details in a figure. I have the X here, have a lot of information. You could even put at the top of each bar, you could put the actual number, percent number, p-values, whatever it is that you want to include. I would say make sure once you create your results, go back to your research question, make sure that you're hitting all, presenting results for every single part of the research question that you asked. And go back to your methods and make sure that for every result that you present, you already explain the analysis of how you came up with those results in your methods.
So the final element of your research article is going to be your discussion section. Well, one of the final elements. So as Ella was describing, your introduction section is sort of like this inverted triangle wherein you begin in a more general background. You begin with more general background information, and then you quickly narrow in on your specific research topic or setting. So it's general to specific. So the discussion is sort of the reverse of that. You want to move from your specific study into a more general discussion. The elements of a discussion section, you want to quickly restate the main findings. I often appreciate when discussion sections have very clear topic sentences. Within the first couple of sentences, authors often just restate their main findings of the paper. I find that many readers actually skip to the beginning of the discussion section if they don't want to wade through your results. They'll just go right there. Yeah, so you want to make your paper as readable as possible, and knowing the tendencies of reading, you can really make your paper as accessible as possible. You'll want to describe the significance of your results and interpret the meaning. So make the finding relevant to the reader. Compare your results with those of other research articles. So you want to say whether your research is congruent with other findings or in dissonance with other findings. You'll want to describe pathways that might explain your results. So give a possible mechanism, and you'll look to the literature to support that claim. Describe the strengths of your study and also describe the limitations of your study. And you want to leave readers with a very clear impression of the impact and the applications of your research. And you can also provide suggestions for future work. So our first recommendation is to describe the possible pathways of the possible mechanisms. So use soft or indirect language So you would say this could lead to poor appetite of pregnant mothers, as cat has a known effect of decreasing appetite in many people, or hence poor appetite of pregnant mothers could lead to poor nutritional status of the mother. This soft or indirect language, you're not making a claim necessarily that this is causal, but you're saying maybe this would impact it. And you want to definitely, as with our earlier discussion of plagiarism, you definitely want to include references that support those claims that you're making using that soft or indirect language. Our second recommendation is to include your strengths. We recommend that you start with your most impressive strength. So in this example, they write, our cohort includes a large number of adolescents with endometriosis, more than double that of the case series and cross-sectional studies frequently referenced. So here, their sample size is exciting, and so they want to highlight that to their readers, and that's wonderful. You want to definitely lead with your strengths.
I often hear people saying, I don't think I have any strengths. I think it's human nature to, you're looking at your study with a magnifying glass and, you're just, sometimes it's hard to have confidence when you're just starting out. You definitely have strengths. If you can't come up with any, ask a colleague, or we'll talk to you more when we come and discuss this more in the workshop. You definitely have strengths, and you should really relay those to in your discussion sections to make sure that your readers understand what they are as well.
Yeah, all have strengths. You should also acknowledge and defend your limitations. So just as every study has strengths, every study has limitations, and it's important to be very clear-eyed and explicit about what those are. So often there's, depending on the journal's author guidelines, the author guidelines of your target journal, there may be a separate section for limitations, or it may just be a paragraph within your discussion section. Here you can read on the screen that this example, they say, our study had several limitations. Chief among that, our data also relied on electronic medical records. So things like that really shape how your findings could be interpreted. So you want to be explicit about stating your limitations. So acknowledge them and be specific about the possible impact of those results, or about the possible impact of those limitations on your results, and then defend them if you think that this possible limitation, you mitigated the effect by being very careful about a particular aspect of the study design, then state that too. Defend your limitations where appropriate, within reason. Our fourth suggestion for your discussion is to include suggestions for future work. So instead of just saying future research is needed, which is a pitfall of many authors, why not be more specific? Why not provide a very detailed follow-up study idea? So these authors state, well-designed meta-analyses and systematic reviews of the current literature on the prevention of IPH are needed due to the high number of published trials. So it's obvious from that suggestion that the authors of this particular paper have a very clear understanding of the current literature on this topic and have provided a really specific suggestion for future work. Our fifth recommendation is that you explain the applications of your findings. And I like that this particular journal actually gives you a section for implications. So that's kind of cool. Make sure that the implications are appropriate for your audience. As Dr. Ella was describing earlier, depending on your target journal, whether it's a PLOS One, which is a really general journal with a lot of topic areas covered, or BNC, pregnancy and childbirth, which is more reproductive or women's health focus, You'll want to make sure that those applications of your findings are appropriate for your specific audience. Make sure that they're not too ambitious. And make sure that you are clear-eyed about whether causal language is appropriate. Our recommendation number 6 is that you should not repeat the results. Don't use old references either. Show reviewers you are aware of all the important and recent findings, discuss and cite them. Continue searching for newer articles as you work on your paper. And avoid citing inappropriate references for biomedical journals, like more casual or informal sources such as Wikipedia and magazines.
Okay, I'm gonna. This is the last section, and then we'll wrap up and hopefully have a chance to take questions. So, yes, when you go ahead and are ready to submit your paper to a journal, make sure that you really pull those author guidelines and are very detailed, read them very carefully, and you follow the guidelines very carefully. When you're submitting your papers, journals, editors complain about submissions that are incomplete. This is a very common pitfall, people across the globe. So be sure that you are very diligent in following the author guidelines when you submit your paper. Allow enough time to complete online submission thoroughly. It's a very tedious process, and it sometimes can take a long time. Just to make sure, sometimes it's easier just to get it done in one sitting, but make sure you allow yourself enough time. And make sure your manuscript is complete with title, authors, affiliations, etc., all the information the journal asks for. I just had a colleague who submitted a paper, and the system generated a PDF automatically based on her submission. And there was a problem with it. There was an error. They didn't include one section of the paper. So be sure that you're checking your automatically generated PDF carefully before you submit it. Very poor writing will cause your paper to get rejected, as well as poor English language. So I recommend working with an editor to improve language and writing, organization and completeness. Preps actually, and Clara and I are here to help you with that. So we will be working with you on scientific peer review as well as the language. We'll talk more about cover letters, and you'll have a chance to practice writing a cover letter in the workshop. It's very helpful. I've talked to a lot of editors, and they all really appreciate getting a cover letter with a submission. Cover letters are sometimes required by a journal, but they're not always required. I strongly suggest always including one, even if it's not required. It's a chance for you to make an argument for the relevance and importance of your paper. Make sure that the journal and editor name are correct. Often we will submit to a journal. If we get rejected, we might use that same cover letter, just do a sort of a copy and paste or a save as, to send to our second choice. Make sure you're changing and updating the journal name and the editor name. Some journals require legal information, like information on copyright, etc. That will all be in the guidelines. And cover letters should emphasize why the study is important, what is new that your study contributes. That's huge. And we have example cover letters that you can look at. And again, we'll work on these in the workshop as well. And we could probably send the actual link. I don't know if in a PDF, should this hot link work? Okay, hyperlink should work from the PDF, where you could get some example cover letters. Okay, I'm going to let Clara wrap up.
Yeah, so to quickly conclude, the key points that we want to communicate to you are that you should strategically choose your target journal, that you need to communicate with authors early about their roles, and that includes author order. You should write a research question that's clear, brief, detailed, and answerable. Follow writing structure or formula for different sections of the paper. Definitely follow the ethical guidelines. Write a convincing and thoughtful cover letter. Thank you. We want for your time. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have now, or you can email us at this email address shown on the screen at any time. Thank you for your time.